My name's Beth Ann Mayer. I am a member of the clergy in the Episcopal Church and part of Vermont Interfaith Action, which we will tell you more about later on. But we are hosting this forum in order to get a chance for voters to be informed and to know who their candidates are. So I'll start on the far end. We have Kathleen James and Cynthia Browning and Brian Keefe, all running for the House seat from this district.
Two seats.
Two seats, right. So 2 out of 3 of these people will be showing up in Montpelier in January. Thank you so much for being here and giving us a good reason to hold this. The format for this evening will be that each candidate will have 1 minute to give an opening statement, and then we have formulated 6 questions that each candidate will have the opportunity to address for 2 minutes each. And then we will have an opportunity to have some questions from the floor. There will be some green file cards that you can write a question on. And then we will we'll look at the questions that come back. So if there's 3 or 4 that are all the same question, we won't ask it 3 or 4 times. If you write a question, if you could just put your first name on there, then we will ask you to read that question when the time comes for that. Do you maybe want to send some green cards out there? Sure. And then each candidate will have 1 minute each for a closing statement. We do ask that the candidates not be interrupted when they are speaking, and that withhold applause until we can applaud everybody at the end. I think that is what I wanted to put out there. Vermont Interfaith Action does not have a partisan stance. We do have some very definite ideas on certain issues, but we do not endorse candidates. And what we really endorse is that people get out and vote in an informed way. And that's what tonight is about. So I'll start with, since I started from right to left, I'll go from left to right. Brian, would you like to give your opening statement? Let me just say that Debbie Ingram will be our timekeeper. She will hold up a 30-second signal and then a stop sign when you reach the end of your time.
And would you just mention that Senator Brian Campion is here also?
We do have Senator Brian Campion with us this evening as well, and hope that you have the opportunity to speak with him as well.
Well, thank you, Beth Ann, and Deb, thank you, and Kathleen for hosting this, and thank everyone for coming out tonight, and GNAT for filming. My name is Brian Keefe, and I am one of the current sitting legislators for this district of Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and Sunderland. I ran 2 years ago because I wanted to help make Vermont a more affordable place for people to live and raise their families here, live, work, and raise their families. My wife and I have 2 children, one 25 and one 19, and we want them to have some of the opportunities that we had growing up in Vermont. I've lived in Manchester 27 years. I grew up in Franklin County, a little bit further north. I'm one of 8 children, all of whom still live in Vermont. Many, like myself, moved away and came back. I have cards out front that summarize some of my experience with Senator Jim Jeffords for 15 years and at Central Vermont Public Service for 6 years, on the Manchester Community Food Cupboard Board, the Zion Episcopal Church Vestry, and others. So thank you very much for being here.
That was a minute.
Goes fast.
All right, well, I won't talk any faster than I ordinarily do. I am Cynthia Browning. I am the other current House of Representatives in this two-seat district. I have been serving in the House since 2007. At first it was Arlington, Sandgate, and Sunderland, and then after redistricting, I've also been representing Manchester. I feel that I'm currently offering my life in service to my community, to my family, and to the constituents of this district. I serve on the Arlington Select Board. I am the executive director of an environmental group, the Battenkill Watershed Alliance, and I serve in the legislature. I feel that I now have achieved a point where I understand state government policies well enough to understand why they don't work for us. They're often at cross purposes and contradictory, and I think I'm developing the knowledge to think creatively about those problems and figure out ways to put in place policies that will actually work for Vermonters, and that's what I hope to do if I get reelected.
Thank you. I'm Kathleen James, and I'm very happy to be participating in a forum this evening with such a strong focus on values, because that is why I'm running for office. As a first-time candidate, I cannot pretend to be an expert on policy, yet. Instead, I'm motivated by everything that Vermont has accomplished and all of the work that remains to build a state that offers everyone the same access and the same opportunities. These goals often seem elusive, but they merit our full pursuit. I'm also motivated by my own life experiences. As a recovering alcoholic, I have learned firsthand about failure and redemption. As a full-time working mom, I've learned what it's like to juggle 3 jobs and scramble for health care and childcare. And as a gay woman, I know what it's like to belong to a community that has been discriminated against and worked hard to win equal rights. That's why I'm here tonight. I'll do my best to answer any question you ask me, to look at it through the light of my values, and if elected, I promise to work hard to build a framework of knowledge around those values. Thank you.
Thank you all. So our first question of 6 is, in 2017, Governor Scott named making housing more affordable as one of his top priorities, and the legislature agreed. Together they passed a $35 million bond to build more housing units. What other measures would you propose to make both rental and home ownership housing more affordable to those who live with low and moderate incomes?
I'm just going to rotate
Yeah.
the beginning.
Sure.
Should I go?
Cynthia, why don't you
Sure.
start?
Sure. 2 minutes, huh? Okay, if you want to have more affordable housing, either you have to increase the supply of affordable housing, or you have to provide more income to those who are priced out of the market. The $35 million bond to build affordable housing will operate to increase the supply. The problem for many is that even if the price comes down, they still might not be able to pay the price of the house or the rent. I feel that this is one of the places where state policy is at cross purposes, because we have a number of different programs that assist people towards home ownership or towards rental housing, and they are inefficient, ineffective, and inequitable. We have been providing support for people of very high incomes to buy expensive houses and to buy second homes, not even in Vermont. And that was through the mortgage interest deduction on your income taxes. That's a really important tool, but it's not clear to me that millionaires need assistance with their home purchases. In addition, the renter rebate, which tries to help people pay their rent given the property taxes that their landlord pays, is extremely complicated, and only one person in an apartment can get it. The property tax assistance program is actually paid for within the education fund, so that even as you are trying to support people to pay their property taxes, you're driving property taxes up. So that's just one example of how ineffective our policies on supporting homeownership have been, and renters. I think we need to have a refundable income tax credit for housing for middle and lower income Vermonters to replace other forms of assistance.
Kathleen.
Thank you. Affordable housing is vital to creating successful communities with families who can afford to live here, work here, and send their children to school here. Here in the North Shire, our most critical need is to create housing for moderate income families. Manchester has recently changed its zoning to allow higher density in the town core, putting more units onto each lot, and allowing the conversion of any existing building to residential units. For example, studios and one-bedroom apartments. This concentrated development is good for families, it's good for businesses, and it's good for the environment because it reduces fossil fuel use, people live close to where they work, and it prevents sprawl. These are small steps we could take that make a big difference. Other projects we could support include expanding the first-time homebuyer program that's offered by the Vermont Housing and Finance Agency. When you talk about housing, you definitely need to think about wages. Across Vermont, the housing wage, the money you need to earn to rent a modest two-bedroom apartment, is $22.40 an hour, about $47,000 a year. It's a bit lower in Bennington County, but the average renter in Vermont earns only $12.85 an hour. That's an affordability gap of $10 an hour. When families have to pay too much for housing, they can't cover their other basic needs, which can lead to a downward economic spiral.
Thank you. Well, on the housing, I was happy to support the $35 million bond, which will attract other money as well. I think the total is expected to draw is about $70 million. I think that's a very important step forward. In addition, at the end of the session, we had a little skirmish over property taxes, and I was on the side that wanted to avoid raising property taxes on rental properties, but that was unsuccessful. It got into the little bit of heated divisiveness at the end of the session, but in the end, the property taxes are going up slightly on rental housing, and every time there's a property tax increase, that hurts people in those rental units. So, and the other issues out there with housing are other costs that are driven up. In my first year, one of the first bills I introduced last year that later became law was one that would help working parents, oftentimes single parents with children in daycare, who brush up against this so-called benefit cliff, where their earning power is halted because we have this perverse system where the benefits they lose is greater than the wages they would increase. So I introduced a bill at the suggestion of a constituent who was caught in this, that allows a person in that situation to defer that income increase into either a retirement account for themselves or an education savings account for their children. So they're able to stay on that career path, avoid the benefit cliff, and start a savings program that will get them to a better place. And so I think there's creative solutions like that can help people stay on that path and get to a place where they can afford to live here and work and raise their families.
Okay.
Thank you. The second question is that the lack of affordable housing can and does lead to homelessness for some members of our communities. Our organization, Vermont Interfaith Action, working with several other allies, has taken up a campaign to eradicate homelessness county by county in Vermont. What can the state do to help accomplish this goal? Kathleen, shall we start with you?
Sure. To start thinking about this question, I did a little bit of research on how many people are homeless in Vermont, and I learned that on a single night this past January, almost 1,300 Vermonters were homeless on that evening. It was called a point-in-time study, and that was up 5% over 2017, which is discouraging. 23% of these Vermonters were children, 18 and under, and 40% were people from households with at least one adult and one child, so they were families. The state of Vermont does pay shelter or motel costs for extremely low-income Vermonters. And last year in Bennington County, this fiscal year in Bennington County, this program provided temporary shelter for 76 families and 125 single adults. While this safety net is very important, it's also expensive. And so I believe our focus should be on preventing homelessness. It's a complicated problem, but I think we can move the needle by creating more affordable housing, which we've been talking about this evening, raising wages, and focusing on social service programs that can help people achieve stability in their lives, including mental health services and addiction treatment. I'm also very interested in a creative solution called the tiny house movement that I've been reading articles about. Norwich University recently won a $20,000 grant for a program in which architecture students are developing 300 square foot micro homes for low-income residents that are not only affordable but highly energy efficient. Nonprofits and churches in other states are also building tiny house neighborhoods that serve different populations, like recovering addicts and homeless people. I would really like to learn more about these programs to see how they could be adapted to Vermont, because I think it's a really creative and fascinating solution.
So I was appointed to the Human Services Committee, and we deal with a lot of very vulnerable populations, including homeless people, developmental disability people, disabled people, people who have a hard time finding a job, unemployed, and the homelessness problem is particularly difficult to solve, but I think the state is making progress in that regard and learning to spend the money more wisely. So when you get to the dire situations, especially the deep, cold nights in the wintertime, we have a better capacity to handle financial capacity and organizational capacity to deal with some of those. The other solution, part of the solution is having a more aggressive jobs program, especially for people who have a hard time getting a job, who have different situations in their own life that are hard to overcome, and getting placed in the workforce and keeping a job in the workforce is very challenging for many, many people in our communities. So a bill I introduced that also became law, this was introduced on behalf of the administration, had to do with the Reach Up program, which is Vermont's social safety net program to help people who are temporarily out of a job. To qualify, you must be looking for a job, you must have children, and you can enroll and get temporary assistance while you're looking for a job. Well, it turns out we had two different systems. There were the federal requirements and the state requirements, and they didn't match up in weird ways that made no sense at all why they didn't match up. And my bill that I introduced and ushered through the House, and it became law, as I said, simply said we're going to have one set of rules, and this is the set of rules that everybody goes by, so the participants and the caseworkers don't have to spend all their time filling out paperwork, and instead they're trying to focus on what they should be, which is to get back into the workforce and get into a job that gets them on a more sustainable path. And those, again, are the types of solutions we need to find and pursue.
I once volunteered in a homeless shelter, and I got to know some of the people who used it and also some of the people who chose not to use it and chose to stay on the street. And I know that almost everybody who ends up homeless has a different story. There are a lot of echoes and a lot of similarities. But I agree that we need to try to prevent homelessness. Instead of trying to solve a problem after it happens, we need to invest in prevention. And since we aren't always going to have more resources, we need to have better coordination. If we could have ways of identifying families in particular with children who are struggling so that we can get them assistance before they actually fall into the place where they have to have a voucher in a hotel or a motel. I think that's what we need to do, and I think you've heard some ways in which we've been trying to do this, but it's a very difficult problem. in addition to the question of increasing the supply of smaller apartments, efficiency apartments, I think the state should try to make a bigger effort to make surplus state land and unused state buildings available to developers who will create affordable apartments or very efficiency apartments. Because the state has been trying to get rid of some of its portfolio of land and buildings, but they still have things. And to me, that would make it easier to provide the kind of shelter that people need. The fact that we have so many people that identify as homeless is a real stain on Vermont's efforts to help people who are vulnerable. And we need to provide them with the ability to help themselves. So I think that if you have a constellation of a number of small steps, all together, they can end up making a difference and having that count go down instead of up.
You're doing great.
She's tough, man.
Still early.
Very intimidating.
So question 3. Much is discussed each year about pre-K through 12 education in our State House. Last year's topics included changes to the funding mechanism, continued consolidation of school districts, changes to special education, and the implementation of an ethnic and social equity curriculum. What changes or additions would you make to the list, and how would you prioritize them?
Well, I think education is one of our strengths in this region and statewide. We have, just in this district, between Burn Burton Academy and Arlington Memorial High School, we have 2 excellent high schools. We have independent schools that are very strong. We have a lot of different options for people in this area, and I think that strength we need to build on and not diminish. Right now, under Act 46, many towns are looking at forced mergers of their schools. So the state would come in and force you to do something that you as residents don't want to do. And Arlington Memorial High School, they're working their way through this process, and it's a challenge. And they need to be supported, the local schools need to be supported in what their local people want to do, in my opinion. School choice is a very important part of this area, and I think that is also often under threat in Montpelier, and I think that's a very important thing for our region. It's part of our culture, it's part of our economy, and people come here to live and work partly because of the strength of our schools, and it's that mosaic of schools that we have around here, all through the district, that make us strong. I think we've missed an opportunity last year. We took a couple baby steps by not enacting a law to require a statewide teacher health care contract. Instead, we negotiate these health insurance policies district by district, and it's a lot of effort that goes into that could be better spent on talking about curriculum and other things. We have a statewide, state employees have a single health care contract. I think our teachers should have. And I'm not talking about taking anything away. I'm just talking about having it more universal statewide, so we're not spending so much time trying to figure out all these details on these individual health insurance contracts, district by district. So there's room for improvement.
Me.
Thank you.
I can't keep track of this. Yeah, switching around. Okay, so in terms of education, to my mind, the funding mechanism, continued work on the funding mechanism is one of the places I would start. I would also try to ensure that no school is forced to merge. I think mergers and consolidation are great, and schools should be rewarded for doing that, but they should not be forced to do that, which involves actually eliminating a democratically elected school board if you force a school to merge, and that's just wrong. I voted against Act 46 because of that, and because the cost of the Act 46 merger incentives, the lowered property taxes you get if you merge, is actually put in the education fund. And it actually is $14 million this year, and it'll be $14 million next year. And that's like 3 cents on the, or 2 cents on the property tax. That's just the latest of a long series of ways in which the state has used the education fund, which is supposed to be for pre-K through 12, to fund its own policy priorities. Act 60 says that the education fund, funded with the statewide property taxes and some state funds, is for pre-K through 12. It's not for supporting housing, it's not for supporting farms and agriculture, it's not for childcare, and it's not for college. I support all of those policy areas and those issues, but they are not pre-K through 12. So one of the reasons why we keep discussing why are property taxes so high and why can't we lower them is because it isn't just the cost of education that's being covered, it's the cost of state policies that were in the state's budget before there was an education fund, and they need to go back there. And that's just an example of how my time on House Ways and Means and my time in the legislature has allowed me to analyze the causes of our problems and figure out what solutions are, solutions that will work, not just arguing about who's going to pay more for what. I also will continue to try to prevent the forced mergers and try to be sure that they're paid for by the state, not the towns.
Thanks, Cynthia. So as we all agree, schools are the bedrock of our communities, and I wanted to tell just a little bit, a quick story about school choice, which is that I moved to Manchester in 1996 after literally conducting a nationwide search with my former husband for a place to raise our family, start a business, and send our kids to school. And we settled in Manchester for many reasons, but chief among them was school choice and the excellence of MEMS and Burr and Burton. So as choice is currently implemented here in the North Shire, a long-standing, flexible tradition, I support it. I agree with Brian, it's an economic driver for the community. In terms of school funding, I think it's excellent that we're rethinking how we fund our schools. I think we need to continue to work to find that right balance of income and property tax, because if you take those together in the right proportion, they paint, I think, a fuller and more fair picture of someone's ability to pay. I probably would have voted for Act 46. I think that school consolidation is working under many circumstances, with our own Taconic and Green merger providing a great example. Creating these larger school systems has the potential to create more savings, more efficiency, maybe more opportunities for kids within the system, as down the road maybe different schools within a system start to focus on different areas a little bit. So I think there's a lot of potential there. At the same time, I do agree that we need flexibility. I don't think we should force mergers on towns like Arlington if there's not a suitable partner. Other areas that I'd like to see us focus on are early childhood ed, taking early action to reduce childhood trauma, which bears huge costs down the road, by leading to mental health issues and drug use potentially, and equal access to vocational programs that are more clearly linked to the needs of our regional employers. I'm also really interested in learning more about Act 77. That's the Flexible Pathways program that my own kids have benefited from with things like dual enrollment, which is, I think, a really creative and interesting solution.
Our question number 4. The current cultural climate in our country is marked by divisiveness and hatred, particularly with regard to race. What role should the state play in dialing back this divisiveness? What do you think about our collective lackluster response to the decision of Representative Kaya Morris to drop out of her re-election campaign because of racist threats toward her and her family? How can the state safeguard equitable treatment of people of all races in Vermont's public systems and institutions, including inside our state house? I believe it's Cynthia's turn to start.
Okay, there's an awful lot there. I think that somehow we have come to a point where certain kinds of speech have been normalized or accepted that I never would have thought would be occurring in public forums. I denounce all forms of hate speech. Nobody should be attacked based on their race, their religion, their ethnicity, their gender identification, or any other protected characteristic. I denounce that very strongly. However, we also know that we have freedom of speech. And the internet and the social media platforms have created private platforms that allow people to be anonymous and to say things with no responsibility. I feel that with every right comes a responsibility, and people are asserting the right to free speech without being accountable for what they say. I know that in the State House, there's a system where if you get threatening messages, you can contact the Capitol Police, and you can contact security, and you can get assistance with a number of issues that do arise when you are a public figure. I don't know the specifics of Representative Morris's situation. I actually did not find out about the severity of her situation until I was with a group where we passed a resolution supporting her, but we didn't know if she wanted it to be public. We didn't know what was going on. I'm really grieved that she withdrew. No one was running against her. Her community supported her. And the idea that someone could force her out of the race in that way is just abhorrent to me. I think that since we're in Arlington, one of the things we want to remember is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, which were, of course, put into illustrative forms by Norman Rockwell. We have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And I think that if all of us don't have those freedoms, none of us have those freedoms. And we have to work for all of us to enjoy those freedoms.
I was horrified by what happened to Kaya and her family. I thought it was a sickening, in-your-face reminder that racism, unfortunately, is alive and well, not only across our country, but here in Vermont. I took the small step of joining the Rutland area NAACP last week. It was a small step, but I'm trying to support groups that are right here in our community that are working to confront and eradicate racism. I would encourage all of you to do the same thing. I was also really glad to see that Senators Campion and Sears spoke up. They asked Attorney General T.J. Donovan to look into this, and he responded by opening an investigation. When I talked to Kaya, she referred me to a recent statement from Rights and Democracy, which I haven't had a chance to explore fully yet, but included a number of steps that the legislature could explore in 2019. I'd really be interested in learning more about these recommendations, including expanding the Human Rights Commission, as you mentioned, perhaps integrating an ethnic studies curriculum into our public schools. I do think that the best way to combat racism is through education, because I think that racism is often based on ignorance and fear. I think it's also really important to look at our justice system and to make sure that people of color are treated fairly by police and the courts in Vermont. According to the Racial Justice Reform Coalition, Vermont leads the nation when it comes to the proportional rate of incarceration for African Americans. They make up 1.6% of our population, but 10% of the prison population. In Burlington, blacks are arrested at higher rates. They are pulled over at higher rates. They receive heavier penalties. So clearly we have a lot of work to do to eliminate racism, not only in our public systems, but by taking a hard look at implicit bias in ourselves.
Well, racism has no place in Vermont, period. And I think that's the message I'm hearing, and I agree with what's been said. But it is among us. I mean, I was doing some work at home 2 days ago. I was sanding my front porch, and the machine was kind of loud, so I put on the headphones that my son gave me. I'm listening to the local Manchester station. And the DJ, who was a woman, and I didn't really recognize, I don't listen to the station all that much, but she said that she was a woman of color and that she had been called the N-word just the day before because of some minor traffic infraction. And she said, you know, this is what happens. And you know, I guess we just can't ever let up on trying to fight against racism and bigotry and all sorts of things in our society that are there, usually a little beneath the surface, but they pop up and we get exposed to it now and then because it's not fair, it's not right, and it's hurtful. So I feel bad for Kaya. I regret that she made the decision she did, but she obviously felt she had to, so I support it. I support the investigation, and I think if there are threats of harm, I hope it's prosecuted to the full extent of the law.
We're up to question number 5 out of 6. People of faith believe in redemption and second chances. What could the state do to ensure that those who come under the care of our correction system can succeed when they are released so that they have a true second chance?
Well, that's a good question. I believe in redemption and second chances. I think all of us here in some form have probably benefited from that. One of the things we changed this year was the opiate treatment policy for people who find themselves incarcerated. It turns out that if prior to this year, if you had a substance abuse problem and were not under treatment and found yourself incarcerated, you were not eligible for treatment. And whereas if you were incarcerated and were under a treatment plan, you could continue that treatment plan while you were incarcerated. I mean, I don't know who came up with that, 2 different systems, but it made sense to me that if you're in prison and you have a problem and there is treatment that available that can help you, then, you know, we should do that. And so that change was made for the good. A lot of the jobs programs that the state has, there's a renewed emphasis on people coming out of incarceration and actually trying to meet people before they come out, so that when they do come out, they have some opportunities. There's incentives for employers. There are counselors that can help people so that when they leave that state of incarceration, they are better prepared to find a job and to work in a productive life. Because having a job is one of the most important things that we can do, is help people find jobs, getting into decent work. And there are jobs out there. So I think in helping with the therapy treatments for people who find themselves incarcerated, helping them find a better path once they get out, we just need to refocus on some of those fundamental things.
Thank you. I think the program to provide more treatment for substance abuse within the prisons that Brian referred to is a major step forward, and I have been advocating that for a while. I did serve on the committee that has jurisdiction over the corrections department for quite a period. And one of the things that was very striking is, first of all, many of the people who end up incarcerated do have substance abuse issues, and also many of them have mental health problems. And in fact, in many cases, they are self-medicating for their emotional or mental health problems with the substance abuse. So one of the difficulties is that prison is not a therapeutic environment, and so people who have mental health issues don't get the treatment they really need. They often just get drugs. And if they have a substance abuse problem, then that's appropriate in terms of treating that issue. But just medicating someone with mental health problems is not helping them with their problems in every case. One of the missed opportunities was after Hurricane Irene, when we rebuilt the Vermont Psychiatric Hospital. We rebuilt it too small. We didn't listen to the experts. We didn't build enough capacity to provide inpatient drug treatment. I advocated for building it bigger and having flexible use modules so that you could use a module for inpatient drug treatment, or you could use a module for forensic mental health treatment. We would have much better capacity, much better ability to treat both substance abuse and mental health issues. And those are some of the problems that keep inmates, offenders, from re-entering our society productively when they come out. I think the job training within the prisons, some of the offenders really take a lot of advantage of them, and some of them get good jobs because of it when they come out. There's also a need for transitional housing and supportive housing, serviced housing. I think that this is also something that should go along with the homelessness problem when you create affordable housing and you also create a service center so that people can get help and be connected with people who will help them with their issues. I think that's one of the ways to go.
So Vermont's incarceration rate has tripled since the 1980s. And as my colleagues have mentioned, this is often because people living with addiction or mental illness are incarcerated rather than receiving the treatment that they need. As I mentioned earlier, Black Vermonters also make up a disproportionate percentage of our prison population. The solution is not to build more or bigger jails, and I don't believe we can arrest our way out of these problems. Instead, we need to take a holistic approach. I think we need to better train and teach our gatekeepers, police officers, first responders, prosecutors, about racial bias, mental illness, and addiction. We also need to continue to work on issues such as bail reform, so it doesn't discriminate against low-income people who can't come up with the cash. Alternatives to incarceration, like diversion programs and drug court for nonviolent offenders. Compassionate release for older prisoners. And as others have mentioned, ready access to services for those who are incarcerated, including education, college coursework, job training, mental health counseling, addiction counseling. I think we need to make sure that the MAT program is working as intended. And as anyone who studies recovery knows, we need to move way beyond medically assisted treatment to put into place holistic systems for people so that they can build a life in recovery, not just substitute one drug for another. One interesting idea that's championed by Vermonters for Criminal Justice Reform, and I would have to look into this to see if it's a good idea, but it caught my attention, is to pay prisoners who are working skilled jobs a higher wage. So instead of earning $1 an hour, maybe they earn something higher so that they can set aside some savings. They continue to pay child support while they're in prison, and if they have savings when they come out, they can maybe afford to get into a stable housing situation. So I thought that was an interesting idea.
So we have one remaining question. Do you want to maybe gather up some, if people have some things written on the green cards, if you're still thinking about something, this is not the last chance, but we'll go ahead and collect some now. So this is our final question of the prepared questions. It is important to Vermont Interfaith Action that our state's economy provide dignity and opportunity for all Vermonters. Yet 40% of the Vermont workforce currently does not earn enough to meet their basic needs. And far too many Vermonters must work 2 or 3 jobs just to survive. What specific measures would you propose and/or support regarding our economy to ensure that Vermonters are no longer left behind even as the economy grows? I think you're the first one, Cynthia, on this.
Okay, one of the things I think would be very effective would be to increase the earned income tax credit on the Vermont Income Tax Code. We actually did increase it this past year as we did income tax reform, but I think we should have increased it further. This is a tax credit, it's a refundable tax credit that provides support for working Vermonters who are in exactly that situation of having trouble making ends meet. It is one of the most reliable ways of actually helping them. In some cases, if people get higher wages, they end up losing some of their benefits. And that's what's called the benefits cliff. And that can be a real trap for people who are trying to earn more, and yet when they earn more, they lose some of their benefits. And we haven't managed to solve that problem, and it's particularly acute for single mothers with children. They lose their child care benefits. So the earned income tax credit is one of the best ways to help struggling Vermonters, and I would have supported having it go higher this year, and I will work for that in the future. I also think the skills training in school and after school is really important. We have a kind of mismatch between the jobs that are available in Vermont and the skills of the people who are looking for work. We have more low-skilled workers and not enough higher-skilled workers, so we have to fill that gap. I would like to find ways to facilitate more employee-owned businesses, because I think that's one of the best ways to have workers be able to take control of their lives. I'd also like to have better ways for employers to do revenue sharing so that workers know that when the business does better, they get a share of the increased revenue. I actually voted to increase the minimum wage back in 2014. The minimum wage in Vermont has gone up 3 times since then, from $8.73 to $10.50. I know it's not high enough. It will actually continue to be adjusted for inflation going forward now. I don't believe that asking for a $15 minimum wage now is going to be the best way to keep jobs for Vermonters that need them. I think they will lose hours and lose jobs.
Thanks, Cynthia. Too many Vermonters struggle to support themselves and their families. Some of the measures that I support include increasing the availability of affordable housing, a common theme for me. Focusing on affordable health care, I would like to see Vermont move toward universal primary care as a first step. I do believe health care is a right, and I'm passionate about that. Paid family and medical leave. Working Vermonters should have the security of being able to welcome a new child or care for a sick family member without fear of losing income or being fired. Expanding access to low-cost, high-quality childcare. The lack of childcare keeps many women out of the workforce, which hurts families and hurts our economy. Making sure that women receive equal pay as men, and also increasing access to job training and vocational education. The minimum wage is a tough one. In considering my run, I've been talking to small business owners around Manchester, and I understand and care deeply about their concerns that they would wind up laying off workers, cutting hours, maybe even going out of business. That said, I would still consider carefully raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour gradually over 6 years with a target of 2024. 45% of all minimum wage workers are over the age of 40. These are not teenagers working part-time jobs after school. The average age is 38. 58% of minimum wage workers in Vermont are women. 22% have children, and 62% work full-time. $10.50 an hour, our current minimum wage, is a poverty wage. It provides no upward mobility for families, period. Something has to give. Thanks.
I support the earned income tax credit that Cynthia spoke to. We did increase it moderately this year, and I hope we can focus on that, because that truly helps people keep more of their money in their pocket at the cost to the overall government, not to the employers. The benefit cliff, we talked about my bill. There's room to go on that. Being on the Human Services Committee, we spend a lot of time. It's a tough riddle puzzle, but that's something that always needs to be looked at carefully. Job training, I think Cynthia mentioned. We have some great job training programs in Vermont. We need to do more of that and encourage more people to take advantage of it. I spoke earlier about the increase in property taxes on rental property this year, which I think was a mistake, and I hope we can avoid doing things like that in the future. And the last topic I'll mention is, on the Human Services Committee, we talked about what are the obstacles to finding a job and keeping a job, and one of them is transportation. Transportation can be a huge expense to people, and so whatever you make, it's pulled back against you. So last year when I was campaigning, I heard about the motor vehicle inspection program that's now in place. And part of the motor vehicle inspection program says if you have it's in a holding pattern right now, partly due to a bill I introduced that won on 135 to 11 vote in the House, only to be rejected by the Senate. But my bill said that the program would have you, if you had a check engine light on, you couldn't get an inspection sticker. So my bill simply said, if everything else works, if there's no safety issue, you can get an inspection sticker rather than spend $200 or $300 or $500 or $1,000 to fix your check engine light. If it's not a safety issue and it's just a cost with a performance issue with your car, you shouldn't, and you're struggling already. Don't take somebody's car away because they have a check engine light on. And that's an issue that goes right to the heart of this discussion.
Thank you. So now we have an opportunity to listen to the candidates answer some of your questions.
So we had several about the opioid crisis, and I think maybe Wendy's is probably the good one.
Hi, I'm Wendy Galbraith, and I'm with Delano, Vermont. The opioid epidemic is a major problem in our local towns. In the last 2 weeks, there have been several overdoses in Manchester, Arlington, and Shaftesbury. What will you do to work towards finding solutions?
And will candidates have 1 minute each? Or?
We've been doing two, so...
Okay,
to answer
2 minutes each.
questions. Yeah.
And I think we're starting with Kathleen.
My answer will probably be fairly short because I come at this from a values perspective, and it's not an issue I've had a ton of time or a ton of opportunity to dive into yet, but it matters very much to me because I am in recovery, long-term recovery. And I think I have a sense of, I mentioned earlier that it takes more than medically assisted treatment to move someone out of addiction into a lifetime of sustainable recovery. It takes a substitution it takes a program of skills, life skills, that you need to substitute for that former one thing you were relying on. So I would be interested in any program that would move people, particularly who are addicted to opioids, off the MAT program as quickly as possible into job skills training, into life training, credit counseling or financial training, any kind of workforce training. These folks need often stable places to live, so help with housing. They need access to a recovery community so that they can talk to people and find a community with people who are struggling with some of the same issues. And I know that one of our gubernatorial candidates, Brenda Siegel, had put together a pretty comprehensive plan for combating our opioid problem here in Vermont, and that would be something that I would be interested in studying further.
Who's next?
Brian.
Thank you for that question, because this is truly one of the great challenges of our times, and I don't have the answers. I'm going to say that right up front. I think the state is building its capacity so we're better able to meet people when they are ready to be met for treatment. It's not perfect. It's not. We're still in the growing pains. You know, on the Human Services Committee, the hardest testimony I heard was from families hit by this. I think we need to keep working at it. We need to find the capacity to have the treatment centers. We need to teach our kids how terrible this is before they become involved with it, and we have to keep working at it. I don't have the perfect answers.
I think that this is a problem that Vermont has made a lot of effort to address. We're trying to make Narcan or Naloxone, the overdose reversal drug, available to all EMTs and to people who need it because of their personal situations. We're trying to provide more drug treatment to reduce the waiting times for drug treatment. In this past year's budget, we have increased funding for mental health and for opiate addiction treatment. We need to provide those facilities when people are ready to take that step into recovery. So it's going to take resources, it's going to take accountability, and we need to be there when we have an opportunity to help someone. I think one of the problems with all of those things is that they do take money, and they take organization, and they take coordination. One of the things we talked about this past session was how could we put a tax on opiate manufacturers that wouldn't be passed on to the insurance companies and the patients, to partly hold them accountable for funding some of the difficulties that their products have generated. How can we tax big pharma? How can we make them responsible for helping us solve these problems? Because they created drugs and said they were not addictive, and they were wrong. And in some cases, it seems like they knew they were wrong. I also think doctors and pharmacists have to be accountable for their prescription habits if they've become part of this machine that dispenses opiates. And then we have to have law enforcement involved, because if we try to control availability of opiates, then sometimes people, if through doctors, people will go to the black market, which is just so dangerous. Every life lost to this scourge is a precious life that could have been a productive member of our community. We can't afford to lose anyone. But as the other people said, there may not be any magic bullet, but working together, I think Vermont can continue to do a better job of supporting people who need this help.
Great. We have a question about climate. Question about climate from Stephanie.
Thank you, Brian, Cynthia, and Kathleen. This has been wonderful hearing your thoughts. Given that we're falling behind in our stated goal to reduce our carbon emissions to 40% of what they were back in 1990 by 2030, which is only a little more than 11 years from now, and our emissions actually increased 10% in 1 year alone. It was 2014, 2015. What measures do you think the state should take, and how urgent do you perceive this problem to be? Thank you.
I've lost track. Thank you for that question. I think it's very urgent. I am not a climate scientist, but I believe we see signs of changes in the climate all around us, including with intensifying hurricanes in the Atlantic right at this moment. But many of the actions we need to take to fight climate change and reduce fossil fuel use are good in and of themselves. Even apart from that, it makes sense to conserve. It makes sense to increase efficiency. It makes sense to use more renewables. It makes sense to increase our independence from fossil fuels. So I support balanced, pragmatic, effective steps in those directions. What I think is really important, and this is again where my experience in Montpelier and my time on Ways and Means is really important, it turns out there are a number of ways within our tax code that we actually subsidize fossil fuel use. We actually allow companies to deduct from their taxes the cost of using fossil fuels. So we also allow certain classes, manufacturers and farmers, not to pay sales tax on fossil fuels. So there are a number of different kinds of hidden subsidies and exemptions and deductions within our tax code that are actually subsidizing the use of fossil fuels. And we need to try to eliminate those before we start imposing new taxes that may have really severe effects on low-income Vermonters. Whatever we do going forward to fight climate change, it can't put a disproportionate burden on the working Vermonters that we've been discussing here so thoughtfully and with so much heart tonight. So I want to make sure that the state is not subsidizing fossil fuel use first, and make sure that the state is supporting renewables use. And I think if we do that and we work together with new technologies, we can make progress on this issue. I think we've already made some progress, but clearly not enough.
Thanks. This issue is really close to my heart as well. I grew up in a family that was very dedicated to conservation and environmental protection. And I am at this point the only candidate in our race to be endorsed by Vermont conservation voters and by the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club. I have a vision of Vermont as the state that leads the nation in adapting to climate change, in mitigating climate change, in pursuing renewables, and in creating a prosperous new climate economy. This is not just the right thing to do in terms of our planet and the urgent threat facing us, but it makes economic sense, and it's also an incredible branding opportunity. Because when you look at young people, they don't deny climate change. They get it. And I do believe we talk about attracting young people to Vermont. I think that young people and businesses will flock to a state that is friendly towards climate change action. So if Vermont is known as leading the nation in this regard, we will attract new residents and we will, I think, supercharge our economy. I'm talking about things like grants and incentives to climate tech startup businesses, transforming our transportation system to support electric vehicles. We need charging stations. We need to weatherize and retrofit buildings. We need to work on getting a mix of renewables in place, solar, wind, biomass. We need to take a hard look at the Governor's Climate Commission and start enacting the recommendations that they worked so hard to come up with. So this is an area that I think I would really relish the opportunity to lead on. I think there's a lot more we could do, and I think it provides many opportunities for our state to leap ahead.
Vermont is a leader, in my opinion, on responses to carbon emissions, climate change. We have an efficiency charge on electricity bill that collects about $70 million a year, I think. We have a gross receipts tax that's collected on fossil fuels that goes to fund weatherization programs. Our electric utility companies are required to give preferential treatment to renewable sources of energy, which helps promote that. Renewable energy developers themselves are eligible for lots of tax credits and incentives and accelerated depreciation. So there are many places that we as consumers in Vermont pay to reduce the carbon output of our citizenry as a whole. And I think, and ironically, as the questioner said, our emissions are going up at a time when they're going down nationwide. Go figure that one out. So obviously, in spite of us spending a lot of money on doing something, we're tracking the wrong way relative to carbon emissions, and so we do need to pay attention to it. But meanwhile, I will state right off, I am against a new carbon tax that's promoted by groups like the Sierra Club and the League of Conservation Voters. I do not think that Vermonters should be layered with a new tax of upwards of 50 cents or 75 cents or $1 on a gallon of gasoline or a gallon of fuel oil, because we're hurting the very people that we're talking about here tonight. It's regressive and it does not accomplish what people think it will, because we are a very small state, and if we think that we can jack up our gasoline price by 75 cents and solve the climate problem, we're in Bennington County. People will go to New York. People will go to Massachusetts. Small businesses will have an advantage over our small businesses. Manufacturers will have an advantage. So even if you think a carbon tax nationally or globally is a right solution, to implement it on a statewide basis is a big mistake.
This is a particularly local issue, but the person didn't sign their name, and it's about the veterans home.
Sonia, I'm going to come to you. I'm Sonia. Wait, Sonia. Thank you. I'm Sonia, and I wanted to know, since the Veterans Home has come up before the House of Representatives, what, if any, action do you think ought to happen or take place for the Bennington Veterans Home at this point?
I think it's Kathleen's.
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry to say, but I do know that Vermont does not do, compared to other states, Vermont doesn't always compare well when it comes to veterans' benefits. I had an interesting conversation with a veteran when I met him at the Arlington Norman's Attic, and I am planning to go down and meet with him in a couple weeks. I know I'm not elected, but it's my duty, even as a candidate, I think, to learn as much as I can about these important issues. And so he invited me to come down and talk to him about the ways in which Vermont does not do particularly well by veterans and could do better. I also have been working with a retired military vet who lives out in Paulet, who is working on a paper for me about this same issue. I don't have it yet, but when I heard this at Norman's Attic, I knew I needed to do some research and get up to speed. So it's very much on my radar that Vermont needs to take some steps to do a better job of caring for our veterans and being able to compete with other states that offer maybe more competitive benefits so that those incredibly valuable members of our society will want to retire here. Because, they retire often fairly early and they still have a very productive career ahead of them, and those are people we want in our state.
Thank you for that question. The Vermont Veterans Home in Bennington is a precious resource. We're lucky to have it in Bennington County, and we need to do all we can to support it because it provides a service for not just residents of Bennington County, but people come from around the state. And it's also part of the Bennington economy, part of the Bennington County economy. They've had some hard times over the last decade or so, but I really think they're getting a lot better. And Colonel Alan Faxon, who lives here in Arlington, is down there part of the leadership, and he keeps us well posted on how things are going. This year they made some changes in how they do the billing to put them on a more sustainable basis relative to the federal reimbursement process and take some of the burden away from the state. That was a huge thing. They've had a nursing staff problem down there, and you can get in the weeds on this really quickly, but they're overcoming some of that. I was in the Appropriations Committee this year when they came up, the Bennington delegation. There were about 6 or 7, including Colonel Faxon, to explain to the Appropriations Committee the changes they were making and continue to make. And I think they're on a great path to providing great service now and in the future down there, and it's something we need to pay close. And as a delegation, we do pay close attention to the veterans, so it's a tremendous resource for our county.
I would certainly echo what Brian said, and I'll just tell you that the Vermont Veterans Home is run by a board of directors, but the workers there are state employees, and the state has invested significant resources in the home. We have invested bonded dollars. That means when the state issues bonds, we borrow money, and we've invested it in state buildings, and we've invested that in the Veterans Home, renovations on the kitchen. We have gotten grants to do renovations for health and safety. We've also put in a geothermal energy system there using state and federal money. So we've put a lot of money into that facility. I think it needs to be available for all Vermont veterans. I think the problems at the home that I'm most aware of, aside from occasional problems with staffing, and I believe nurses are in demand everywhere at this point, has to do with the census, and that means how many patients there are there. When you're running a hospital, there are very high fixed costs. And so if you don't have your beds full, you're going to have very high costs, and it's going to be difficult to cover them. So I think they've done better with making sure that they are marketing themselves and making sure all veterans know about the facility. I think I would like to see more work done on whether the Vermont Veterans Home, when it has vacancies, could accommodate veterans from New York or Massachusetts who are on waiting lists. There are veterans on waiting lists in other states, and those states won't let them come to Vermont. And I understand the question of being near family, et cetera, like that, but, and they could go back once a place opened up in there, but to say to people, no, you have to stay where you are without the care you need when Vermont has a space for you, I would really like to see high-level work by the governor's staff with those other governors to do that, because it would be good for those veterans and it would be good for the veterans home and make it more sustainable. But the state government has really committed. We have provided funds in the budget and from the capital bill to that veterans home, and I don't believe we're going to do other than that in the future.
I think we have time for one more. This one is more about the minimum wage increase, and it's Steve.
Back here. Okay, so refresh my memory. My name is Steve McClafferty. The one question I have, on one hand, there's talk about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And Kathleen just mentioned that a reasonable hourly wage is about $22 an hour to be able to afford a reasonable rental apartment. My question is, then, what is the true minimum wage that should be paid?
Well, the Vermont minimum wage law right now, I think Cynthia summarized, the minimum wage has gone up 50 cents the last 2 or 3 years, and now it's indexed to inflation going forward. I've heard from a lot of employers that the result of a big jump in the minimum wage to $15 will result in fewer jobs and people working fewer hours. I think there are smarter ways to go about providing help to people at the lower end of the income level. We've touched on a lot of those here tonight. Earned income tax credit. I got a note after the session from an employer who's works with a nursing company, and he said, I wanted to thank you for approving a budget that included a 2% increase in the Medicaid Choices for Care program. Our company has passed the entire increase to our licensed nursing assistants and their aides who are raised to their hourly pay. So I think that's an example of a better way to go about getting more pay and getting people to a more productive level so they can live and raise a family here in Vermont. We have to do it smarter. I think minimum wage, you can argue about what a minimum wage should be. I think right now Vermont's current minimum wage law is about where it should be, and as far as providing assistance for people, we need to do it in a smarter way.
I think that the minimum wage is a floor. And as I said before, I supported raising the minimum wage in 2014 because it hadn't been raised in Vermont for a long time. But I think it's important to let the businesses absorb the increases we've had. I'm not averse to future increases, but we need to let businesses absorb it. Most of the jobs in Vermont are from small businesses, and they need time to absorb this. I think that one of the best ways to increase the wages people earn is to increase the productivity of their labor, which means they're more skillful. They have more technology to increase the revenue that can be earned with their labor. We also have to increase the revenue businesses can earn. A healthy economy is the best way to increase wages. So it's not an easy problem, but we have to be careful thinking that we know how to intervene in just this one place of the economy and it won't have all these unanticipated effects. It will. The economist said that hours will be reduced, jobs will be lost, some people would be better off, but many might not, and many might lose benefits so that they're no better off. So I support paying Vermonters higher wages, and I support affordable housing assistance, tax credits, other kinds of things that can help us get them there. But I don't want to actually cause problems for our small businesses by intervening again too soon. The proposals that we've seen had no exemption for small businesses. If we were talking about businesses of over $100, I could consider that. There was no way to adjust if you had a recession. If you've raised the minimum wage and we go into a recession, and we will because no expansion lasts forever, the unemployment rate for those workers will be higher than it would have been otherwise because you've lost the flexibility of the wage that usually adjusts. So you need to be very careful when you intervene in the economy not to do things that will have unanticipated side effects and hurt the people you think you're helping. We can return to this later, but I can't go there yet.
Yeah, the unintended consequences. You know, when I think about voting on future bills, a minimum wage increase and a carbon tax are two of the bills that I think I would want to dive the most deeply into study, because you don't want to wind up hurting the very people that you think you're helping, and you don't want to pass something that turns out to be regressive, something that hurts small businesses, something that hurts low-income people when they're trying to fill up their tanks. So I think those are two really tough ones. As to what the true minimum wage should be, I also don't know the answer to that. I know it's something that should be achieved gradually through steps. You know, the bill that was passed this year would have taken it to 15 by 2024. It wasn't an immediate thing. But I also want to look at the larger context, as my colleagues up here have done, which is to say, in addition to raising wages or looking at wages, we need to look at housing, which we've talked about a lot tonight. But I also want to come back to healthcare. I think that healthcare is a huge cost for workers all across this country. It's a huge expense for businesses. Healthcare, I believe, is something that is a right. And I would really like to see us moving toward universal primary care here in Vermont. That would shift that cost away from small businesses. It would save money down the road, I think, by helping people get the preventive care, the regular care that they need, so that things don't spiral out of control and become, you know, an emergency room visit down the road. So if you want to talk about interlocking problems with helping people who are struggling in Vermont, let's talk about health care. Because I think that goes to the heart of the matter just as much as wages, just as much as housing.
Well, thank you all for your thoughtful answers on these complex questions. It's really hard to sit there and spout something out for 2 minutes that can be meaningful, but I think you all have done it. I just want to, in this final portion, give you a little bit of idea of who Vermont Interfaith Action is. We are 53 member and affiliated congregations throughout the state of many different faiths. Our focus is on systemic change, not on meeting immediate needs. Many of us have spent and continue to spend a lot of time serving community meals and serving the homeless, but realize that what we'd really like to do is not have to do that, and to have people operating at a level that they don't need that kind of assistance. And that takes systemic change. So we get together to try to figure out how we can move systems forward that can meet people's needs at a better level. As you can tell from the questions, we have groups that are trying to effect change around affordable housing and homelessness, education, criminal justice reform, economic dignity, and systemic racism have been our main issues for the last couple of years. We welcome new faith communities and new individuals to become involved in our work. You can check out our website, very simple, viavt.org, or speak to me or with Debbie Ingram, who's our executive director tonight, to find out more. But especially, please vote. Please vote in the election on Tuesday, November 8th, or go to your town hall and vote early.
6th, it's the 6th.
The 6th.
It's November 6th, sorry.
People are paying attention.
That's
great. You won't be able to vote on November 8th. You won't miss it. But you can go early and vote, which is a very effective thing to do, and it allows you to then forget about things on Election Day, except encouraging your neighbors. If you have a question about where your polling place is, you can go to the Vermont Secretary of State's website and Google it, and go to the elections page on that website. So as Debbie said earlier, we will give Each person 1 minute for a closing statement, and then we will have the opportunity to discuss things further with them over some eats. So, let's see. Brian started this last. Cynthia, I think it's your turn to start first.
First of all, thank you for this opportunity. I always learn so much from the questions and from the other candidates. It's actually a wonderful experience. I want to say that some of my campaign materials are in the table there and also in the table in the hall, and I expect the other candidates have some too. I also have voter registration sheets and absentee ballot requests in my car. Those are all available from your town clerk and also online, but I can go get them from your car. Because the absentee ballot, it's really easy to vote early in Vermont. You don't have to have some kind of excuse or you're going to be sick or out of town. You can just go get it and do it. It's really easy. Take advantage of that. I think that there's a lot of shared values and shared policy goals among the candidates, and that's a good thing. It shows that Vermonters know what the problems are and we know what we need to try to solve. What I'd like to ask you tonight is to consider whether I'm not the strongest candidate in terms of actually developing solutions to the problems that will work. Because of my experience, because of my training in economics, and because of my strong principles, I'm the candidate that can actually make progress in solving these questions.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the promises I'd like to make to all of my constituents if I'm elected. First promise is that I will listen to you. I've spent a lot of my career working as a professional journalist. Just as I prepared for tonight's debate, I listened to all different points of view. I conduct extensive research. I explore all sides of an issue, and I know how to discern fact from opinion. I will bring these skills to the state legislature. I will work toward tripartisan solutions. I am a proud Democrat, but I grew up in a conservative Republican family. I respect ideas and opinions from all parties, and I believe that bipartisan solutions forged from conversation and reasonable compromise are the most powerful and enduring path to lasting progress. I also believe in communication. I will keep you informed. I will publish a newsletter. I will hold office hours and meetings all over this district. You'll be able to look on my Facebook page and my website and see how I'm voting. You will not need to dig into a database to find out what I'm doing in Montpelier. I'm running because I care about values and I care about these communities, and I ask for your vote on November 6th.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight, and thanks to our hosts, the church here in East Arlington and the congregation. Thanks to GNAT and the people watching at home. It's really been an honor and a privilege to serve this district over the past 2 years. I think we've made some great strides up in Montpelier. It's been a great privilege to be on the Human Services Committee where the challenges are great. We've touched on some of them here tonight. It's a big part of the state budget. We need to manage that budget wisely, but we need to also care for the most vulnerable people in our state. And that's, I think, a lot of the work that goes on up there, and it's a great privilege to have served the last 2 years. You've got choices in November. That's a great thing about America. You get to speak and vote and choose. And in this two-person district, you get to vote for 2 people. And I really hope that I've earned your support, and I hope you will support me on November 6th with your vote. And thank you very much.